A Guten Erev Shabbos. It's a curious dimension of life that we often depend on. We rely on others to point out to us what's most important and outstanding about ourselves, what we really should know and recognize for ourselves, because somehow when others say it, it's more meaningful than when we ourselves recognize something. As an example, we know that the Jewish people excel in sciences, arts, and letters, and civic endeavors. We're represented in those fields in numbers that vastly outweigh our tiny numbers among humankind. That's a clear fact, and that should be satisfaction enough on its own. But somehow it's not, and there are some of us who literally keep score that week in October when the Nobel Prizes are announced. Thanks to Google, we search up the newest laureates in physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, peace. Is she Jewish? Is he a member of the tribe? Sounds Jewish, I'm not sure. Is Bob Dylan the best they could do? It's somehow very deeply satisfying when this committee, you should pardon the expression, of Gentiles, searches the world for groundbreaking pioneers in the fields of human endeavor and comes up with about 500,000 of Yidden usually. And what do we value more than wisdom? The book of Proverbs teaches us, do not forsake wisdom, and she will protect you. Love her, and she will watch over you. Wisdom is supreme, Proverbs continues. Therefore, get wisdom. Though it cost all you have, get understanding. Another classical Jewish text, Pirkei Avos, the ethics of our fathers, teaches us in the name of Ben Zoma, who is wise? Someone who learns from everyone. Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, writes in Koheles, his book of Ecclesiastes, written towards the end of his years. There he says, wisdom gives life to those who have it. The greatest compliment we can give someone is to call them a Talmid Chacham, a student of the wise, a student of wisdom. Not just knowledge, but insight, discernment, and all those qualities that are deeper than just knowing what's out there. It's knowing what it means and what to make of it all. Who's our first wise person? Avraham recognized God through contemplation and reflection. What could be wiser than that? Yaakov showed us how to make the most of what you're given. We have this in depth throughout his story, whether it's in relationships or in shepherding. Always figure out how you can maximize your resources. And as we mentioned, King Solomon was, of course, named the wisest of all men. But the first wise person as such in the Chumash is identified in this week's Parsha, in Miketz, as Yosef. Yosef, remember, who was his father's favorite, who did not somehow have the sense to keep his arrogant dreams to himself, who spent time combing his hair, and who wouldn't allow himself to be taken out of prison to meet Pharaoh until he had a haircut and a clean suit of clothes on his back. And yet, when Pharaoh and this young fella finally meet, and Yosef not only interprets Paro's dreams, but also proposes a plan of action, including raising taxes, by the way, that meets with Paro's approval, Paro takes note of Yosef and his talents and proclaims it as such. He says, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. Ein navon v'chacham kamocha. So here you have it, the first Nobel Prize for dream interpretation and economics. The leader of the world's superpower recognizes this young man, this 20-something, who's recently done a 2-year stint in the slammer for a Me Too incident involving the wife of a man who enslaved him. And all of a sudden, Ala Legedula, Yosef is raised to greatness. Let's just for a moment take notice of the rapidity of his rise. Immediately after, he not only interprets Paro's dreams and proposes solutions in perhaps the world's first session of brief solution-focused therapy, Sigmund Freud, Eat Your Heart Out. Yosef is then immediately awarded all the trappings of power, the signet ring from the sovereign's hand, a wife named Osnat, which then somehow became a very popular Hebrew name for some reason, and who happens to be the daughter of his former owners, Potiphar and Mrs. Potiphar. And also, Yosef gets a new Egyptian name. Since Rabbi Steinsaltz passed away this summer, I've been inspired to look at his Chumash for explanation and insight. I've not been disappointed. We know that Yosef was given this Egyptian name, Tzafnas Pa'aneach, which doesn't really have a parallel anywhere else in Chumash. The commentaries struggle to figure out what the meaning is exactly, and they usually say it means someone who holds the key to secrets, who discerns mystery, reveals hidden things, or something like that. Rabbi Steinsaltz brings a fascinating insight, at least I certainly never made the connection. The second part of Yosef's name, Pa'aneach, Tzafnas Pa'aneach is his new name. Pa'aneach is spelled Pei Ayin Nun Ches. The last three letters, Ayin Nun Ches, are Ankh. Ayin Nun Ches, Ankh. You know that Egyptian symbol, it looks like an upside down teardrop sitting on top of a T. It's on the Isle of Jura Scotch bottle if you need a visual. Ankh, my Egyptian's a little weak. Ankh is a hieroglyphic that apparently means life, and it's a very high honorific. Think of Tutankhamun. So with great insight and recognition of Yosef's gifts that Pharaoh gave him his name, indeed Yosef would go on very soon to be the cause, the force behind Egypt's surviving the 7 years of famine and still retain a food surplus, which we have evidence of by the brothers coming to Egypt looking for food. Now, just two quick parentheses. I mentioned last week that I think about the Haggadah and the Seder all the time. So think of the order that we say at the beginning of the Seder. Kadesh, Orchatz, Karpas, Yachatz. What's the step of Afikomen? It's not called Afikomen in that order. It's called Safun, hidden. The Afikomen is hidden, as we all know, or at least set aside until the end of the meal. Safun means something that's concealed. That is the first part of Yosef's name. Tzafnat Pa'aneach. The one who takes hidden things and finds the life in them, to use an awkward but maybe more complete translation. The other thing to mention is that this most unique name was used many centuries later by a most unique rabbinical scholar as the title of his collected writings. Rabbi Yosef Rosen of Rogachev titled his sefer Tzafnas Pa'aneach. Bialik once met Rabbi Rosen and was staggered with the Rogachever's knowledge. He said, it's printed in the Jewish newspapers from the times, I believe the Morgen Journal, he said, from the brain of the Rogachever, one could carve out two Einsteins. If you want to know what the Rogachever said when he heard that, talk to me at the Kiddush. So now back to wisdom. We said that the highest honor we bestow is Talmid Chacham, the student of the wise, which we apply to Torah scholars. To push that just a little bit further, our friend Rabbi Weinrib mentions a definition of wisdom from the Jewish ethical literature, the Musar school of thought, a sefer called Madregas Ha'adam, the stature of a person. The author there writes that sheer Torah knowledge in itself is insufficient to make a person wise. Very interesting. In other words, a person's gone through the entire Talmud, they know the laws as printed in the Shulchan Aruch and other codes and so on. It's not enough. Interesting. It says that they also need to be conversant in many realms and areas of human endeavor, of regular life, to be able to select the appropriate pieces of information and apply them usefully and in a relevant and meaningful way. Well, that's a definition we don't hear all the time. So if we look a little bit deeper into what constitutes wisdom, the Oxford University Press published a handbook of character strengths and virtues, and here are their 5 points of wisdom for us to consider and perhaps apply. One is problem solving with self-knowledge and sustainable actions. 2 is contextual sincerity with regard to the situation and knowledge of its positive and negative elements. 3rd is knowledge of diversity in ethical opinions and consistent actions based on values. 4th is tolerance toward uncertainty in life. And 5 is empathy toward and understanding of one's own emotions, seeing ourselves as part of a larger whole. Now let's see how those fit into Yosef's story and maybe how they fit into our story also. The interesting hook of the story is that Yosef had these problem-solving talents, and it probably said sustainable actions on his business card. That's what made all his efforts successful. He was very good at that. Point 2, knowledge of the positive and negative aspects. That's what made Paro sit up and take notice of Yosef's dream interpretation and his proposal to help get Egypt through the famine that he accurately predicted. 3rd point, Yosef clearly understood that there were many approaches to the problem, but his explanations and proposal for action were internally consistent. And what stands out for me anyway, is the last 2 points. Yosef is remarkably tolerant, even accepting of the uncertainty in life, from the earliest incidents when we meet him until his death at the end of Chumash Bereshis. He realizes that there are ups and downs, and almost without exception, he remains on an even keel. One exception we could argue is that when he sort of panics in jail and begs the soon-to-be-released wine steward to remember him to Pharaoh when he gets out of prison. But Yosef's life is full of ups and downs, and he seems to maintain his equilibrium by and large throughout, which itself is a signal display of wisdom. And lastly, understanding one's own emotions and putting oneself in context. These are on display pretty much through the entirety of the Yosef story. This week, the next 2 weeks' parshas, Yosef is able to see himself in context, in relation to others. One of the best articulated views of an introspective person towards the end of his life. After their father Yaakov dies, Yosef calms his brothers with acknowledgement that although they probably fear him taking revenge for everything they did to him, he has no such intentions. He states a biblical version of "it's all good." He says, "You had evil intent toward me. You intended ill towards me," he says to the brothers, "but God thought good of it." Or, in other words, all's well that ends well. Atem chashavtem alai ra'ah, Elokim chashava latova. All these seem, to me, immediately relevant to us in our current situation. In the past 9 months, we've had a lifetime of ups and downs, lockdowns and hopeful moments, gathering together and staying in isolation, so many other tribulations. But just those last 2 points give us light in the darkness. Tolerance toward uncertainty in life and unconditional acceptance. This has been a very uncertain year for all of us in ways that are too many to count. So much of what we thought we could rely on in life proved unstable. On the other hand, there are some things that we knew were permanent and enduring. Emet v'yatziv, as we say every morning in davening. They are true and certain. We know, come what may, that Shabbat, Torah learning, tefillah, tzedakah are unchanging. Our circumstances change, but these are always good, no matter what the circumstances. They are our anchor, and they allow us grounding to realize what's important and to be able to accept and somehow keep some of our equilibrium, our balance, in the uncertainty of this past year. And empathy and being able to see ourselves as part of the larger whole. It's actually very nice that in Canada we've heard on the radio from the politicians and so much of the media, we're in this together. I'm embarrassed and more than a little bit ashamed of the messaging that was heard from and in the United States of pitting one state against another, one governor competing with another for funding and medical supplies, politicians sending uniformed troops to commandeer respirators from remote locations and such. That's not the way to behave in a pandemic. Yosef, for sure, should have been put in charge of this one. He would have known how to manage. Thankfully, we're aware of our own emotions during these difficult times and seeing ourselves part of families and communities, vital stabilizing forces in uncertain times. We probably feel a bit like the brothers in the story. We're unsure of what's going on, nervous and anxious, not sure which way is up sometimes. But we should heed those words of Yosef's that we said before. That which seems negative now, God intends it for the good. As the first vaccines this week are administered, with no doubt more ahead, it's now time for us to strengthen each other and ourselves so that we emerge at the other end of this global crisis, not only intact, but stronger and closer and hopefully wiser. Good Shabbos.